Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is defending President Trump's decision to kill Iran's top military commander in Iraq. The administration says General Qassem Soleimani was actively planning attacks and threats against American troops in the Middle East. The U.S. airstrike killed him overnight near Baghdad's airport. Iran is now vowing revenge. And earlier, Secretary Pompeo said despite the strike, the U.S. is committed to de-escalation in the region.
What's different today is that Iran has now been engaged for months and we're managed dozens and dozens of attacks throughout the region. President Trump's shown enormous restraint to date. While we've made clear to the Iranians that we weren't going to tolerate the killing of Americans, on December 27th, an American was killed in Iraq. And then we watched the intelligence flow in that talked about Soleimani's travels in the region and the work that he was doing to put Americans further at risk. And it was the time to take this action so that we could disrupt this plot, deter further aggression from Qassem Soleimani and the Iranian regime, as well as to attempt to de-escalate the situation. The risk of doing nothing was enormous. The intelligence community made that assessment, and President Trump acted decisively.
For more on this now, let's bring in Face the Nation moderator and CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. She's joining us now from Washington. So, Margaret, you heard what the Secretary of State had to say. He says that Americans are safer now and that the U.S. remains committed to de-escalation. Certainly in the short term, it doesn't seem likely either of those things. We know that we know that the U.S. is telling Americans in Iraq to get out as quickly as possible. And it feels like we could be on the verge of something bigger, perhaps a major military conflict. Are there efforts underway to defuse this situation?
This is an act of war. Assassinating Qassem Soleimani, not only one of the most revered generals in Iran, yes, someone the U.S. considered a terrorist, but someone who was so close to the supreme leader of Iran is like taking out the vice president of the CIA director of the United States. This is a real escalatory action. It is really important to underscore that Iran has been escalating tensions with the United States through these attacks on U.S. interests and allies over the past few months. Qassem Soleimani has been plotting against the U.S. for decades. And in the past 2.5 years, the pace of some of those attacks has ticked up, particularly since the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran. That's still, it's in tatters, but still there, at least as of today. But what happens next is unclear. The Trump administration, as you rightly point out, is justifying this targeted assassination on Iraqi soil of Iran's one of their most powerful general as something that helps protect American interests because it stopped an imminent attack. But they are not telling us what that attack was. They are not saying what the actual threat was. They are not explaining the intelligence behind it. So there are a lot of unanswered questions here that we have to believe need to be shared with the American public. Certainly Congress will be demanding. But given that we already knew the U.S. was deploying, the Trump administration was deploying more troops to the region to put us on a war footing here, the table is being set for a real escalation between the United States and Iran going into an election year. And really at the very same time that there's an escalation with North Korea, as it looks like the diplomatic talks with that nuclear power are also faltering. So this is a real serious thing in the national security community that really has left many reeling.
The Trump administration seems to have taken a go-it-alone strategy with Iran. Congress was not consulted. The reaction from some of our allies has been tepid or lukewarm, even though I think you'd probably agree that there are not many people who are going to miss Soleimani in terms of allies. Right. But is this action going to force our allies to take a side in an escalating conflict?
Well, what's interesting is that not just our allies, but some of our adversaries are saying this was a really bad decision by the United States. You have the Russian Foreign Ministry out there saying this is reckless. You have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo working the phone phone lines right now trying to explain things to China about why the U.S. carried out this targeted assassination. So the U.S. is concerned about its allies, but it's also getting some blowback from adversaries who are concerned that this is something that could cause problems for them, spillover for the region throughout the Middle East, but also for broader global stability. Remember, at the end of the day, that diplomatic deal with Iran that President Trump pulled out of, that the rest of the world stayed in, was an international agreement. You had every single world power standing together trying to get Iran to back away from a nuclear program that was just getting developed. They are not a nuclear power yet. Targeting one of their most powerful leaders may change that calculation by Iran. So there's a lot of speculation about worst case scenarios, but that is what our allies are worried about this morning. Does Iran use this as a reason to pull out completely from the deal and go nuclear?
You know, Margaret, I think that when we've talked about this, not just with Iran, but with some, other countries, perhaps like North Korea, that at times it looks like the administration has like different messages, right? That are competing messages. So we have just the president days ago talking about how he wants peace, talking about how he's ready to renegotiate the nuclear deal. Yet it was this president that pulled the U.S. out of the nuclear deal with Iran to begin with. And clearly this act of killing a military leader does not look like an act that is pursuant to peace. So where's the diplomacy here?
The diplomacy is non-existent. The diplomacy at this point is about explaining rather than building a coalition. What we don't know, and this is also really interesting, the silence from Israel. Israel viewed Qassem Soleimani as a major enemy of the state. That is an ally that has to be thankful he's off the battlefield, but also very concerned about what may be happening in their backyard in the next few days, weeks, and years to come. So there is a lot of concern around the world today about what next. And you point out that there's often discordant messages within the Trump administration. And it is so interesting, and this is one of the things that makes covering the Trump administration challenging, because we know that President Trump's own personal views are not always matched by his top national security leaders. The president campaigned on a promise, just like President Obama did, of bringing the troops back home from the Middle East. And every president gets into that office, looks at the intelligence, sees the threats, and basically revisits things. President Trump has rebuilt the U.S. presence since May. 14,000 U.S. troops have gone into the region. So the narrative bringing the troops home isn't matched by these actions, as you rightly point out. But what is also interesting is that no one actually wants to go to war here within Republicans in Congress. There is apprehension. Yes, there is praise of President taking an American enemy off the battlefield, but there is not a march to war from members of Congress who know there is fatigue among the American public that may not be matched in the Trump administration's, some would say, overconfidence in saying that it can carry out an assassination like this without escalating.
Margaret Brennan, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.